Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Ricardo Vinuesa. I'm an associate professor at KTH in Stockholm, and I'm going to be telling you about our work on computer vision tools within deep learning to make predictions in turbulent flows. This work is funded by the European Research Council, the ERC, and also the Swedish Research Council. I'd like to start by telling you about some early work on machine learning applications to fluid mechanics and general flows. Some of the earlier work comes from Petrov-Koumoutsakos group, where they use neural networks to predict the flow in the near-world region of a turbulent channel. This is over 20 years ago now. And more recently, there has been work on being able to develop inflow and boundary conditions, being able to predict the subgrid scale model for large area simulations, some nice applications to flow control, and also, of course, applications to runs and sampling from experimental measurements through PINs, physics-informed neural networks. So there is a wide range of areas where we can actually see how machine learning can help in fluid mechanics. And we have a recent review paper together with Steve Branton, which you can see here, where we summarize basically the applications of machine learning to computational fluid dynamics. So we show that one can use machine learning to improve direct numerical simulations, to make them actually faster and more efficient. We actually use machine learning to improve modeling in the context of runs and LES. And also one can develop quite some applications of machine learning for reduced order models. And that's quite a nice area as well of applications. The reference is here. The article is published in Nature Computational Science, and you can see more information there. Today, I wanted to focus on non-intrusive sensing. So essentially what we want to do is use information at the wall and predict the flow above the wall. If we look at this figure, essentially this orange plane would be the wall, that would be the input information, and this blue plane would be the output, would be the flow that we want to predict. And the application of this comes from flow control. So if we are able to know what the flow is doing with quite some level of detail, then we can develop better opposition control, reactive control strategies to try to achieve a better drag reduction performance. This is work led by Luca Guastoni. The reference is over here. It's published in JFM. You can see all the codes and all the data there, and you can also find more technical details in this publication. What I would like to start by doing is summarize the type of data that we use. So we conducted direct numerical simulations in a turbulent open channel. So we really wanted to have simpler dynamics of the large scales by having an open boundary at the end. And we consider friction Reynolds numbers of 180 and 550. So we conducted DNS to produce basically thousands of instantaneous flow fields to be able to establish the correlation between the wall and the information above the wall. We will be using deep learning tools to be able to establish this mapping, and we will show you a little bit what are the possibilities and the performance behavior of the various models in this predictive task. So first of all, what type of architecture should we use? At the top, what you can see is a multi-layer perceptron. That's a neural network that is fully connected, where all the neurons of the input are actually connected with all the neurons of the next layers. And this architecture has one limitation when you're looking at images, or generally at data where there is quite strong spatial correlations. In turbulence, we have a quite localized behavior in terms of spatial information. You have coherent structures, and therefore it's interesting to use some architecture where we can exploit this sort of spatial correlations to make our predictions. And this is not something that the MLP can actually do. So at the bottom, I'm showing you basically the origin or the most basic form of a convolutional neural network. In a convolutional neural network, what you have is an input, that will be the source image, and this little window that you see here, that's a kernel that's sweeping through the input to produce a feature map, essentially. Those are the outputs that we can obtain from our convolution operation. And the nice thing of this architecture is that with a quite a small kernel of 3 by 3 or 5 by 5, we can actually try to exploit the spatial information. We can actually see how the data is organized in space and try to obtain nice correlations from that input data to try to identify structures in the flow. And we will see that will help us to effectively make predictions in the context of turbulent flows. So this is a schematic representation of one of our architectures. You can see that we have 3 input fields, okay? The information at the wall that we will consider are the 2 wall shear stress components and the wall pressure, so basically quantities that you can measure at the wall in your turbulent flow. And at the output, as you can see here, we are showing the possibilities of predicting the 3 velocity fluctuations above the wall. So once again, we use wall shear stress components and wall pressure at the wall. We want to predict what happens above the wall at different wall normal locations. In this case, I'm showing you a quite a standard CNN, convolutional neural network. We have 6 hidden layers, and this is the number of filters that we have for each of these layers. Turns out that this architecture, which is not really that deep, performs really well. What we do is that each of the filters is identifying 1 or more features in the input data. The first layers are identifying features that are smaller because of the size of the receptive field, and also they're simpler. But when we applied a concatenation of convolutions one after the other, what we do is that we're progressively increasing the size of that receptive field, so we now can identify structures that are larger in my input data, and also we are hierarchically building more and more complex coherent structures. So you see, we are actually going towards the end of the network to features, to structures that are larger and more complex. And this hierarchical way in which the convolutional neural network is learning is very similar to the hierarchical structures, to the hierarchical manner in which turbulence is organized. So that's why this computer vision architecture, this convolutional neural network, is quite well suited to be able to make predictions in turbulence. And it turns out that if we have even deeper networks, this is a case of 6 hidden layers, we have shown in some of our recent work that going up to even 30 hidden layers with the same number of parameters. So if we reduce the number of filters per layer and we increase the depth of the network, we obtain even better performance. That's because we are able to build, through all the convolutions, progressively more and more complex features in our data that will essentially improve the performance of what we can actually predict. Okay? So let's look at some of these schematics. Again, the work is by Luca Guastoni. This is the reference in JFM. Over here, we're seeing the 3 input fields. So these are the 2 wall shear stress components and the wall pressure. This is our CNN. And this over here would be the 3 velocity fluctuations above the wall. And this is an example at Arita of 550, which is already a quite turbulent case, which exhibits enough scale separation to make meaningful comparisons in this study. What I have shown you so far is what we call the FCN method, the fully convolutional network. So we're applying convolutions all the way from the input, which is an image, to the output, which is another image. Turns out that there is another method, this is developed together with our colleagues at Carlos III University in Spain, Güemes and others documented it, where we can combine fully convolutional networks and POD, proper orthogonal decomposition, which in other fields, the POD is also known as PCA, principal component analysis. They're basically relying on the SVD, the singular value decomposition. So in this approach, what we do is that we take the spatiotemporal signal, the velocity field, we apply POD, and then we decompose the spatiotemporal signal into spatial modes and temporal coefficients. So the idea is that we will fix those spatial modes and we will focus on only predicting the temporal coefficients of our flow. Now, an interesting thing, you can see in the domain that we have tessellated our flow field. We have really made these smaller subdomains. Why do we do that? The idea is that if we have in each of these subdomains scales larger than the size of the domain, all of those scales get lumped into the first POD mode, which means that we reduce significantly the number of temporal coefficients that we actually need to predict. So this is done purely for computational convenience. Now, it's important to choose the number of these subdomains effectively in such a way that we can ensure the continuity of the reconstructed signal, which is something that we have done and we have rechecked through evaluating the power spectral density. So basically, These subdomains are designed in a way that we can reconstruct the signal pretty efficiently without any discontinuities, but at a quite good computational cost. Okay? And all the details are again in this JFM reference that you can see over here. So let's look at some results. Here I'm showing you instantaneous stringwise velocity fluctuations at RE tau 550. The third row is the DNS, so this is basically the reference. The first column is at y plus 15, so that's in the near wall region. The second column is at y plus 100, which is now in the outer region. And I'm going to show you the performance of various methods. The first row is based on what we call the extended POD. Okay? Extended POD, which is formally equivalent to linear stochastic estimation. The linear stochastic estimation makes a linear correlation between the input data at the wall and the output data above the wall. And as we know, turbulence is inherently a nonlinear phenomenon. In fact, turbulence, if you look at the interscale interactions in turbulence, you have one part which is linear, mostly linear. That's what we call the linear superposition. So the large scales really imposing their footprint in the near wall region and linearly increasing the amplitude of the fluctuations. That's something that a linear method can reproduce quite well, but then you also have a nonlinear component, and that's the modulation. The modulation which takes place across a wide range of frequencies, and that's something that a linear method cannot really reconstruct. Right? If we compare the first row, which is the linear method, with the DNS, which is the third row, that's the reference, we can see that the streaks, the structures that we are predicting, are first of all exhibiting lower fluctuations. The intensity of the fluctuations is attenuated. And second, the nonlinearities and the span-wise movement of those streaks is actually quite attenuated as well. We can see that there is some sort of filtering effect because our linear method is basically not able to account for the nonlinearities in our flow case. So the linear method is not going to be optimal for this type of prediction. If we look now at the fourth row, which is this one over here, that's based on the FCN method. So I take my whole input at the wall, I use convolutions, and I predict the whole outputs at the off-wall location. And you can see over here that in the near wall region, we obtain excellent agreement. We can predict very well, in an instantaneous manner, the fluctuations in the near wall region using wall information and relying on a convolutional neural network, on the FCN approach. And the second row is what we call the FCM POD. So the second row is the one that is relying on the POD. And if you look at these two panels, we can see that the agreement between the reference and the FCM POD in the outer region is actually really good. So it's interesting because in the outer region, the dynamics is dominated by few large-scale structures, these large streaks that you can actually encapsulate quite effectively with POD, and then you only need to predict the temporal coefficients of a few modes. Whereas in the near-wall region, the picture is much more complicated. So you cannot just do POD and predict some temporal coefficients. You need to do something a little bit more detailed. No? And that's why, in short, close to the wall, the FCN method is better. Far away from the wall, if you want to do large-scale control, then the FCM POD is probably a better choice. Okay? And this is something that we are showing for the instantaneous flow. But if we look at a statistical description of the results, you're going to see that the results are actually pretty similar. What I'm showing you here are the stringwise, wall normal, and span-wise velocity fluctuations. These are the RMS profiles. The black lines are the DNS, so this is actually the reference. And then I'm showing you in the squares, I'm showing you the extended POD, so that's going to be the linear method. The triangles are the FCN, where I use the whole wall to predict the off-wall information, and then the circles will be the FCN POD, where I'm using the POD to help me in the predictions. And what is interesting is that in the near wall peak of U prime, of the stringwise velocity fluctuations, the error that I make using the FCN method is less than 1%. So I can basically nail the predictions in the near wall region. Of course, all the predictions get worse as I move farther away from the wall because the correlation between the input and the output data gets worse. But interestingly, the linear method, the extended POD, is the one that exhibits the worst performance, right? Because we cannot really get those nonlinearities that are present in the flow. And the FCM POD, which is the circles in this case, gets a bit better at y plus 100. So you can actually see how our performance is a bit better there. And we get an error level that is on the order of 25–26% with the FCM POD. So, of course, the outer region is more difficult to predict, but we can still get quite reasonable predictions if we want to do large-scale control with the FCM POD methodology. Something quite interesting is what we call the transfer learning. So in transfer learning, we use what we learn in one case, and we try to use it in another case that is not too different but not too similar to the original, in such a way that we can get a more effective training process with our neural networks. So this is an example at Arita 180, where what we're going to do is take one architecture that was trained to make predictions at y plus 15, and we're going to do transfer learning to make predictions at y plus 30. So an architecture to predict very close to the wall, and we're going to predict a bit farther away from the wall. In this case, we're going to freeze the three first layers, because as I mentioned before, the first layers are identifying smaller scales and simpler features, which in principle should be more similar close and farther away from the wall. And we will retrain the three last layers. So we will keep the same information in the three first layers. We will retrain only the three last layers with data at y plus 30. This is also work by Luca Guastoni, and this is all the details are in the Journal of Physics conference series. So in this conference proceedings, you can actually see all the details. The results look like this. So it turns out that with the transfer learning, we can obtain very similar error levels. So essentially we get the same performance, but we reduce the training time to 23% of the original. So we actually obtain a much more efficient training process with the transfer learning because we exploit what we learned in the previous case. Even more interesting is to do transfer learning from low to high Reynolds number. So what we're going to do in this example, in this example you have all the details in the JFM reference, is to take a network trained to make predictions at Reynolds tau 180, and then we will take those weights and transfer them to a network trained, that is going to be trained to make predictions at Arita 550. And the idea, as you can see here, if we compare the amount of training data that you need and the performance that you can see in this table over here, what we see is that comparing with random initialization, the network with transfer weights requires only 25% of the data compared with the original network. In other words, I can take most of the training done at a low Reynolds number, a Reynolds number that can be trained on a laptop. I mean, we can run a channel at Arita 180 in a laptop nowadays. So most of the data is obtained in a very cheap way, and I can reduce the need for Arita 550, the very expensive data for which you already need a supercomputer. We reduce the need of that expensive data by a factor of 4. And you obtain essentially the same error levels, the same performance. So this is something that we should be doing. We should be using transfer learning to exploit what we learn in one case and to be able to use it in other configurations to have better accuracy at the end, because you don't need to relearn things that you already knew, and to more effectively use the data that you actually have. Okay? So this is all about predictions from the wall to above the wall. Something that we have done so far is assume that we have DNS resolution at the wall, that we have really all the information at the wall. But in reality, if you do an experiment, you will not have DNS resolution at the wall. You will have a limited number of sensors that allow you to make these predictions. Now, if we consider a case where we have limited resolution, we will resort to a different architecture. We will use something that is called GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks, and these GANs are shown schematically in this panel over here, as you can see it over here. So in this architecture, you have actually two networks. You have one part that is called the generator, and the generator is taking low-resolution images as an input and is producing high-resolution images that follow the statistical distributions of the reference data. So that's what the generator is doing. And the discriminator has the job of identifying if a particular high-resolution image is real or if it was produced by the generator. So these two networks, of course, have antagonic roles. They're trained together using game theory, and eventually what we do is that we obtain a generator that is very good at fooling the discriminator. So we can produce high-resolution images with quite some high accuracy. And this architecture is leveraged in this setup over here. So what we do is that we start with low-resolution images at the wall. We will produce high-resolution images at the wall with the GANs architecture. And those high-resolution images at the wall will be used to predict the flow above the wall. So we will go from coarse data to high-resolution data above the wall. And some results can be shown here. Here I'm showing you information at the wall. So this is the instantaneous wall shear stress distribution in the streamwise direction. This is the DNS. So this is basically my reference. And in the first row, I'm making the input field progressively coarser and coarser and coarser. You can see in this case, I'm downsampling by a factor of 16 in each direction. So it's a very, very coarse input. You can see that any information about the structures is basically lost. And on the second row, I'm showing you the reconstruction. So I want to compare the second row with this information over here. What you see is that in all the cases, of course, for low downsampling, the reconstruction is excellent. But even in the very, very coarse situation, the streaks are looking very physical, very realistic. That's what GANs is good for. We can actually obtain very physically looking and realistic images. So the streaks are where they need to be. They have the length that they need to have, and their spacing is also correct. So even if there is a slight attenuation of the streak intensity, we find exactly where they are. So if we want to make flow control and tackle those streaks, probably we will be able to do it. I also want to say that in this downsampling that you can see here, the spacing of the sensors is actually similar to what is obtained in an experiment. So actually, this sort of super resolution could in principle be extended to experimental setup to be able to reconstruct flow fields from very, very, very coarse data. This is work by Güemes and others, together with our colleagues in Spain, in Madrid, and this is published in Physics of Fluids. So you can see also all the information here. Now, what happens if we try to look at the flow above the wall? Well, the first row would be the DNS, so that's the reference. I'm showing you results at y plus 15, 30, 50, and 100. And as I go down, I'm increasing the downsampling. So I have progressively more and more downsampling as I go down. Now, the easiest prediction is basically these two panels, because I'm very close to the wall and the downsampling is quite low. And the hardest prediction is actually this panel and this one. So in this case, I'm having very, very, very high downsampling. I have very few samples at the wall, and the input and the output are very far from each other. Even in this case, comparing this panel, which is the DNS, with this panel, which is the prediction from the GANs, even in that case, we can identify the location of the large-scale streaks. So we're losing most of the details of those streaks, but their size, their length, their separation in the span-wise direction, those are correct. So in principle, if I want to do large-scale control of those streaks, I can actually use this GANs methodology to try to have a reasonable representation of those structures. So this is very promising when it comes to flow control, to be able to, in real time, because remember that once a network is trained, the evaluation is basically almost instantaneous. So in real time, I can actually sense the flow and obtain quite good representations of my architecture. And the last example of today, where we are going to do predictions, is going to be a bit of the opposite exercise. So instead of using information from the wall to predict the flow above the wall, we're going to take information from above the wall to see what happens closer to the wall. And this is work that can be found in archive. So you have all the reference here and all the information here. The motivation for this is to try to develop wall models in turbulence. We are not going to develop a wall model, but we're going to use a series of architectures based on convolutional neural networks as a purely predictive exercise. And this is what it looks like. So we want to basically reproduce some earlier work by Mizuno and Jimenez. What they did was to take a turbulent channel and in the overlap layer, exploit the self-similarity of the scales there. So basically take a plane in the overlap region and rescale it with respect to the wall normal location to impose it as an off-wall boundary condition at the beginning of the overlap layer. Basically, what they were doing is, try to exploit that similarity of the scales in the overlap layer. What we're going to do is something similar. This is at Aritau 550. We're going to take information at y plus 100, which is the first row, and we're going to try to predict the flow at y plus 50, which would be closer to the wall. The DNS, the reference, is the first row, so this is y plus 100. In the second row, I'm showing you the DNS at y plus 50, so this is what I'm trying to predict. I'm using the information in the first row to predict the information in the second row. And the third row would be the predictions with the fully convolutional network architecture. What I'm showing you in the columns are the instantaneous velocity fluctuations in the stringwise, the wall normal, and the spanwise directions. So you can have all the information here. What is interesting is that the U prime, so the U fluctuations, are in very good agreement when using the FCN to make these predictions. And the V and W, so the wall normal and spanwise fluctuations, they qualitatively look quite good, but there are some discrepancies, there are some differences. Turns out that the predictions from the wall to above the wall are much easier than what we are trying to do now. Because when you have the wall as input, all the small scale information is already there because of the effect of the large scales in the near wall. But when you try to do the opposite, when you take a large scale in the outer region and you try to put a small receptive field to try to get information from that large scale, you're actually missing some of the information of that extractor to make your predictions. And second, you're missing the small scale information. Your input doesn't have the small scale information. So in principle, your network will have some problems trying to reconstruct this sort of small scale details. These are some things that we want to target with our architecture. What I'm showing you over here would be the power spectral densities at y plus 50. Yeah? So you can actually see the shaded gray would be the reference, and the lines would represent the predictions. So what we see is that the predictions are quite reasonable in U, even for the large scales, but some of the small scales are missing. This is something that you can see in all these cases. You're missing part of the small scales because of the effect of, well, in the outer layer you don't have that information, so it's very difficult to reconstruct it. And in the larger scales, in V and W, I start to see some deviations there. Well, it turns out that I get less than 20% error in the U prime, which is pretty good. In B and W, I have slightly larger errors, but I can get quite decent predictions using convolutional neural networks. Turns out that I could possibly try to alleviate the problem of the receptive field by playing a bit more with the pooling layers in the first, at the beginning of the network, so that I can reorganize the information of the large scales so they fit better the size of the receptive field. And I could probably reconstruct some of the small scale information using GANs. No? So that's something that can be tried to try to enhance these predictions. Once again, the information is in this archive reference. And remember that this is a purely predictive exercise. If we want to get an a posteriori wall model, then something more refined than this would be needed, no? Because this is just ensuring that I can reconstruct the fields. But if I want something that on the fly, as you are running the simulation, becomes consistent with the local physics, then you need something a bit more sophisticated, probably relying on reinforcement learning, as we will discuss in some future videos. But at the moment, this predictive exercise gives us some potential, no, for this type of predictions. Okay, and this was all for today. I want to thank you very much for your attention. I want to also thank everybody who made this video possible, including InfraVis, the KTH Visualization Studio, and the KTH Digitalization Platform. And I want to refer you to my email and my contact information, also my social media, and to go to this YouTube channel for more information on other works that we are doing related to this. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.